Hello and welcome again to Understanding Transitional Justice in this third segment of this week's presentation on the social context of post-conflict and post-regime justice. I want to talk about justice as a forum for political conflict. And the basic point that underlies what we'll be saying here is that the process of post-conflict and post-regime justice is a process in which members of different social groups compete for credibility as interpreters of the meaning of the past. That is, compete for the ability to impose, at least to a certain extent, their interpretation of the meaning of the past as the official one, as the most widely accepted one, as the one that will determine political action. And in some respects, we can regard this process as a zero-sum process. That is, it implies that a gain of credibility for one group means a loss of credibility for another group. And it also means that to the degree that post-conflict and post-regime justice processes are about the laying of blame, a group that is successfully identified with perpetrators of violence and with violations might face the consequence of exclusion from very much of political life. And this is the argument that is made by Leah David in her article on veterans and veterans mobilization and post-conflict justice. She argues that much of what happens in processes of post-conflict justice is an effort to disable some major political actors, or to exclude, or to marginalize some potential political actors. Now, in this case, who are the actors in this conflict? There are two main sets of actors. One set of actors is represented by the state. Another set of actors is diverse. It is represented by groups of people who have direct experience of violence. Some of them as victims, some of them as perpetrators, some of them as carriers of social memory related to violence, some of them are political activists. This will be a group that is composed of different and distinct groups. And what is at stake in the interaction between these groups is the question of what will be the shape of officially approved memory of the past. And the goal of each of the participants in this process, whether it's the state or whether it's representatives of groups of people with direct experience of violence, is to achieve a role of exclusivity or something close to exclusivity as an interpreter of the past. Now let's talk about the role that is played in this process by politicians, that is, by representatives of the state or people competing to be representatives of the state. What the political actors fear most in these processes is that any kind of determination and endorsement of any kind of particular interpretation of the past is going to come at a cost. At what kind of a cost? They are interested in material costs, that is, costs that are represented by money, property, other forms of compensation. That is, fear that any sort of recognition is going to be accompanied by demands for reparations to be made to former opponents or to victims, or demands for assistance to be made to people who are able to achieve the status of victims. So that's one set of costs that political actors are concerned about. Another set of costs that political actors are concerned about is political costs. They're concerned that coming out with a position on the meaning of historical memory will alienate members of the public who they count on to be their supporters and to keep them in a position of political power, will further social division and the potential for conflict in the social environment, so will make the political situation over which they preside unstable, or could be damaging to the international prestige of the state. This is why in a lot of post-conflict debates, you find that a lot of claims about historical experience and the meaning of history are interpreted as attacks or potential attacks on the identity or image of the state or of the nation, as efforts to label the nation as being perpetrators, as being guilty. what we can say is that the perception of fear on the part of political actors is accompanied by the perception of opportunity, that certain kinds of findings and certain kinds of interpretations will provide them with the opportunity to discredit their political opponents. And this is probably the meaning behind, for example, the establishment by right-wing parties when they were in power in states like Poland and Hungary of things like museums of communist oppression. And they do want to promote a certain version of the memory of state socialism and of communist rule. But what they also want to do is to identify this period with their political opponents in what are now social democratic parties, and to present their potential return from power by winning an election as presenting a danger. The ways in which political actors will deal with these fears is through a transfer of responsibility. That is, to the degree that any kind of violations are recognized, responsibility is going to be deflected away from the state and away from institutions of the state for the most part. And if it's deflected away from institutions of the state, who is it going to be directed toward? It's going to be directed toward informal actors, often paramilitaries. It's going to be deflected outside the state toward internationally powerful factors that made events inevitable. So the general orientation of actors on the level of the state is going to be finding ways to say that it is not the responsibility of the institutions of the state or of the powers, certainly the current holders of power in the state. To the degree that they will say that the state is involved, they will say that the state has been occupied by a force that is alien to the state. This becomes a big issue in contention in places where, for example, in post-conflict environments, it is not entirely clear how the violence that took place is popularly perceived. So if we want to look at states of the former Yugoslavia, there are states where the violent conflict of the 1990s is regarded as a source of pride, is a constitutive part of the mythology of national identity and of the formation of the state, right? The wars are understood as wars of independence or as wars of liberation, like in Croatia, like in Kosovo. In some places, these same wars are regarded, at least in part, as sources of shame, as environments in which violations were committed, of which the public should be ashamed, from which many parts of the public want to take some distance, which is more the case, but not entirely the case, in states like Serbia and Montenegro. Look, there's an implication in this, and that is that there are incentives for the state not to take a leading role in memory projects most of the time. And if the initiative doesn't come from the state, that means the initiative has to come from organizations outside of the state, either geographically outside of the state in the form of international organizations and other interveners, or structurally outside of the state in the form of citizens and victims organizations, peace organizations, reconciliation organizations, other organizations from the civil and from the non-governmental sector. It's important to keep in mind, though, that none of these organizations have the kind of capacity, have the kind of reach, have the kind of access to information, or have the access to means of distributing information that the state has. So finally, when we talk about the competing roles of different actors in post-regime and post-conflict environments and the sorts of goals that actors have, I want to end this segment of the presentation by offering one caution that may be important, and that is we should beware of the temptation of assuming that there is unity or there is consensus in any society, either about what happened or about the meaning of what happened, or what the goals of activity in the present are. This probably does not exist in any social environment. Questions like this are always at the center of dispute over political power and over the future of the community.